Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Lance French, and I'm the Director of Marketing for W&M Environmental, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on making deal-making strategies for contaminated properties. Our speaker today is Michael Whitehead, Chairman of W&M. Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have questions, comments, please send them to me through the chat tab on your GoToWebinar window. If we don't get to your question, I will make sure that Mike sees it and we will get an answer to you as soon as possible. We are recording this webinar and it'll be available to rewatch later this afternoon along with the slides that Mike uses, and I will send you an email with the link when they are made available today. So that's enough out of that. Let's get to it. So today's webinar, we're going to talk about some introductions for what are your options going to be for buying and selling and leading on contaminated properties. Do I pass on the deal? Do I move forward? The big question, how much is this going to cost? This webinar focuses on solutions for contaminated properties in Texas, and we only have 1 hour, and we can't address everything. So introduce you to Michael Whitehead. He's our chairman of W&M Environmental. He has a Bachelor in Science in Soil Science and an MS in Soil Chemistry from the University of Florida. Go Gators. He has 25 years experience, professional experience, and phase 1 ESAs to regulatory closure on contaminated sites. So Michael, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lance. Really appreciate that. Been in the business a while, worked for a large consulting firm when I started working Superfund sites, and one of the passions I've had, I think, in the business has had over the years is finding ways to close contaminated properties. We've had sites that have been in programs for 20, 30 years, and all it was a money trap, like the old movie years ago, for houses. You just kept putting money into it, groundwater monitoring, groundwater treatment, with no solution and the property not being redeveloped. So one of my passions personally, along with the firm, has been how do we fix sites that have been in programs that we can find a way to clean them up and close them. Now, not all sites are that complicated. Some of them are very simple that may have some minor metal issues or something like that, which we'll talk about today. So moving along, I think the first question is, how do we determine if the property is contaminated? I mean, first of all, is it a dry cleaner or service station? For a lot of the real estate properties in Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, some of the big cities, older parts of town, there was dry cleaners and service stations all around the area or on the site itself. And honestly, looking at properties and experience with them, if there's been a dry cleaner or service station, there's usually a problem. And a dry cleaner doesn't have to be big to be a problem. It could be as small as a large room with one machine, and a couple of years of using perchloroethylene or perchloroethylene or perc, so to speak, yeah, you're going to have a problem. Amazingly, we found a lot of sites that have used perc in the past have had a problem in the soil and groundwater with the perc going through the concrete, out the drainage system. There's a myriad of different ways that could have contaminated sites. So other ways, obviously, you look at TCQ, EPA files and look at the previous sampling reports. Sometimes the owner has his own data that he's not really sent to the agency, not uncommon. And again, I'm not going to go through all these little bullets. I mean, I'll let you guys go through your own bullets, but I'm going to add stuff in between the bullets. The whole rec and all that kind of stuff, recognize environmental conditions. There's a lot of acronyms. I'll try to go through as many as I can as we go through it, but obviously I'm not going to hit all these acronyms.
Okay, Michael, can you give us an example of a property that you've dealt with recently that had a little hair on it, so to speak, that you can give an example to our listeners?
Well, former industrial properties obviously have a lot of hair. We've worked at some pretty large properties with very large industrial facilities historically located on them, where it could have been metals, chlorinated solvents. They've been in a program for 10, 15, 25 years. Obviously, those got a lot of hair on it, so to speak, in that the soil is contaminated, the groundwater is highly contaminated. There may be free product I mean, anytime you have free product like it could be light phase, but the more complicated being the DNAPL or dense non-aqueous phase liquid that's right at the bottom of the formation, and it's very difficult to get out. And those are going to be more challenging, or sites that have a vapor intrusion issue and high vapor readings. So those are the ones that are obviously going to be a little more challenging to figure out. So the other thing to mention here is you're not going to know until you drill or sample. The old drill, baby, drill. A lot of times you got phase 1 reports that come up, say this, we think that, well, it could have been this, but until you really sample, you're not going to know, and that's the real determining factor. Now, going on to the next slide is basically limited or comprehensive. How many samples do I take? And that's a big question, because most of our guys that call us on the real estate side are going to be saying, wow, how much is that going to cost? I want to keep my costs low. Well, at the same time, you want to know, do we have a problem or not, and can we, be sure that the results you're giving us are accurate. In other words, if we say the property's clean, that it's clean. In a lot of these deals, I tell people, you're going to do it again. Somebody else is going to buy this, you're going to sell it, it's going to happen again. I mean, a few people hold it forever, but somebody else is going to do the deal in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and guess what? The next guy is going to want to do the same. So if you buy it assuming it, thinking it's clean because your consultant did a phase 2 and it said it was clean, but when you go to sell it, the next consultant's more aggressive, does more samples, and find out that it's dirty. So you're the one, the current owner is the one going to be holding the bag, and so to speak, and paying for the difference in that now he thought it was clean, now it's dirty, he's got to pay the difference. So it's a fine line to walk. How much do I do, and how much do I want to pay? It's nice to have an accurate picture, more accurate picture by doing more samples, but it doesn't always give you the bang for the buck. For example, we've seen lots of reports where guys went out and just sampled for, analyzed for everything, semi-volatiles, PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, a full RECRA list, not just the basic RECRA 8, but the full 13. So the cost got really high, like $15,000, $25,000 for a real estate deal, not an industrial facility. Industrial facility is going to be much more expensive and much more robust sampling because they have more issues and more source areas. But I'd say a service station or a dry cleaner, strip center, sometimes you got to determine how many samples are better, good, what's the right portion. That's why having a good consultant, I say at the end, is find an environmental professional that help you figure out what you're trying to do, and that's where you've got to tell them, hey, this is what I'm trying to do, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, help me to make the right decisions. So going back to the previous where they oversampled and overanalyzed, you see a bunch of data that says non-detect. Well, that helps a little bit, but the flip side of that is, wow, did I need to do all those semi-volatiles? Maybe I could have done one like total petroleum hydrocarbons as more of a screening analysis. Maybe instead of doing the full RECRA 8 metals, I could have just did lead and arsenic because my primary concerns were lead and arsenic based on historical usage. So you're going to do a few RECRA metal samples, but you're going to do majority of lead and arsenic, and then the hottest samples you might want to run the full suite. Same thing where if you had a few TPH hits, total petroleum hydrocarbon, you're going to run the full SVOCs. So, and then the other thing you do is do a lot extra sampling, but hold a lot of the samples and not run them unless you have to. So again, I think it's trying to find the right balance, and it's not always easy. So moving on, and let me say this. One good example was we did a site for a real estate developer, a large one in Dallas, and the previous consultant did like 3 or 4 samples, soil samples at a dry cleaner site, and came up and said it was clean. Well, anytime you see a dry cleaner been operating there a long time and it's clean, I get suspicious, and we went to the seller, actually was getting a loan, say, hey, listen, I think you need to do more sampling. This is not enough sampling to be conclusive. So we had to do some bigger wells permanent because it was a low yield formation and it took a long time for the water to come in. We did more soil borings, and lo and behold, we found lots of perk. You could smell the perk in the soil, smell like a dry cleaner. And that site ended up going through the Texas Municipal Setting Designation, which we'll talk about later, and the Texas Voluntary Cleanup Program. So it went from it's clean to it needed an MSD VCP combo. That price difference was significant. So you can see that going too limited may, in some situations, not be good. There's no one magic sample. I think some people think we can go out there and do one magic sample and get a lucky location and tell them that the property is clean or dirty and only spend $1,500 to $2,000. It's just not going to happen. Your low-end phase two, if you just had to do a few surface soil samples, it'd probably be like $4 to $5, $6,000. And if you're going to put in monitor wells, you're going to start to edge up to 8 to 10, and even more, like 10 to 15. So depending on the samples, but there's no one magic sample. I wish there was, but there isn't. Okay, moving along. Vapor intrusion, hot potato issue.
So Mike, when I did some site development for another company, and back 10 years ago, and vapor intrusion wasn't really an issue back then. Why is it such a hot issue now?
Well, that's a good question. Well, look at the thing here. So many historically closed sites, nobody cared about. VCP, leaking petroleum storage tank, corrective action, did not include an evaluation of soil gas or indoor air vapor. The big thing is, I think, the EPA has a lot of rules and regulations. A lot of states, other than Texas, I think Minnesota, California, New York, just to name a few, have vapor intrusion rules and regulations. And a lot of your national clients that we deal with, like Starbucks, CVS, to name a few, are concerned about vapor intrusion. So when those guys are looking at the properties, they're going to be driving the fact that they want more information about the liability and information about vapor intrusion. There was a couple of sites we looked at that one was I think the old Dixie House on Northwest Highway, where you could walk in and smell gasoline because the next door neighbor had a leak, was in a leaking petroleum storage tank, and it was in the contaminated groundwater had moved underneath that building, and you could smell the gas in the morning when you came in. So people like their pancakes and coffee, but they don't want the smell of gas. And same thing with a local coffee shop. If you smell, everybody knows the smell of gas. Perk is a little harder to distinguish, but everybody knows gas. So you can smell it very quickly. I always give the example, if you go to a gasoline store or a service station and you get a little gas on your shoe and it's in your car, you can't get rid of the smell. It just travels with you for a couple hours. So you roll the windows down. Same thing with vapor. It's so noticeable and it's such a negative that I think it's been driving this. So key thing is here, again, I'm not going through each one of these, is soil gas results are compared to the EPA vapor intrusion screening levels and is not regulating Texas per se. Now, indoor air is, but the soil gas is not. And typically our biggest ones that we run into is going to be trichloroethylene, which is a solvent used in some of these industrial facilities, and also a degradation product of PERC, and vinyl chloride, which every once in a while you'll run into vinyl chloride as a product, but typically it's a degradation product, again, of PERC or trichloroethylene, and benzene. And the reason why is they have pretty low vapor intrusion screening levels, so their vessels are fairly low, and so they come up as issues typically when we're looking at soil gas. And as another note, with the soil gas, we don't have as many reporting requirements. We don't have reporting requirements that we do if we do an indoor air sample. So if we do an indoor air sample and it triggers the TCQ rebels, risk-based exposure levels, then we have some notification requirements. And if I'm correct, on soil gas we do not. So that's one big advantage that we have with the soil gas, and that's why a lot of guys, I think, like to do it. But it is becoming a very hot issue, and a lot of sites, again, like we said, they were closed. Oh, it's got a closure, Mike. You don't need to do more sampling. Again, they didn't look at soil gas. It wasn't an issue per se back in the 90s or 2000s when the sites were previously closed. So now we may have a closure, but we're going to have to go back and resample for soil gas to ensure that there's not going to be a vapor intrusion problem. Okay. TERP versus PST, I'm not going to go into the detail here. let you guys that are listening look at the slide itself. But basically for us, there's going to be two programs that's typically going to fall under the Texas Risk Reduction Program that a lot of voluntary cleanup program sites, corrective action, dry cleaner sites will fall under, and then the petroleum storage tank. So it's pretty much the non-petroleum storage tank service station type sites they're going to be dealing with TERP versus petroleum storage tank. And at TCQ, I mean, they're going to have the guys there that are going to look at these sites. It'll go LPST or it'll go TERP. So anyway, there you go. Moving on. Okay, so the site's contaminated. What are my options? You know, run away, drop the deal. You know, it depends on risk. We deal with a range of customers, just like probably some of the guys listening today. You know, some guys have no tolerance for risk. If you mention environmental, the deal's done. As some people call us, they go, I want a clean phase one. Well, I can't make it clean or dirty. It is what it is. But some guys have no tolerance for environmental. Then you have medium, a lot of medium in the middle. Then you have some that are looking for contaminated properties. They like the risk. They know the risk can help them make a deal. So you got the full range. I think a key thing for us, and anybody probably listening, if you're dealing with a customer, is find out what's your level of risk. What do you plan to do with the property? Are you going to turn it fast? Are you going to keep it for 1 million years or 50 years, whatever? What are you going to put on? Are you going to put Starbucks? You know, they're going to be asking, and they're going to be very conservative, for example. They're going to look at a lot of things. Their consultants are going to come in and look at every little item. They're going to be very picky, and that's okay. That's what it is. So what are they going to do with the property? How much is this going to cost? What's our strategy? Are we going to be long-term remediation? Are we talking about free product removal, abatement? I mean, is this a $50,000 problem? Is it a $1 million problem? Is it a $100,000 problem? Trying to figure out what you're going to do. For example, I'd like to know, how much is this deal? Is it a $100,000 property deal? Is it a $5 million property deal? You know, if it's obviously a $100,000 deal and you got $75,000, $100,000 of environmental, that's a problem. You know, if it's a $10 million deal they got to have and it's $100,000, $110,000 to fix it, hey, that's what we're talking about, and see if we can resolve it. Real quick one here. One of those is, can I screen out of the Texas Risk Reduction Program? I'm not an affected property. Can I get out of the program completely and avoid that process? Because it takes time. You go to the TCQ. Now, I love the TCQ. They do a great job compared to other agencies we work with, and I've worked with personally, going through a lot of the states of the Southeast. TCQ is awesome. But again, if I can screen out a program, I'm saving time and money. Voluntary cleanup program, VCP, I think it's the gold standards for all contaminants, all media, all current and future landowners. That sounds good because it is good. Leaking petroleum storage tank, which I mentioned for above ground and underground storage tanks, innocent owner. It's limited to properties that did not cause or contribute. It's not for people that think they're just innocent. Now, sometimes people go, hey, I didn't cause it. If you buy a property that's contaminated already, you're not going to be the innocent owner. And I think sometimes people get confused and think they didn't cause it because somebody historically caused it. They could be the innocent owner. It's really for the contamination coming from off-site onto your property. One of the really great newer programs is the municipal setting designation. We do the Plano Champions, Lance and I, and we joke that there's MSG, monosodium glutamate, that's bad, and MSD, municipal setting designation, which is good. Because a lot of the brokers that go to that are not as experienced in environmental. So to simplify, MSD is really good. It's basically has to be a city approval, so it depends on the city. Some cities do not have an MSD, and some cities will never have an MSD. But there are a lot of cities that have: Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Denton, along with other cities that do case by case. Wiley's got a new MSD, Farmers Branch has got a new MSD, Wichita Falls does one, and some cities, I think Beaumont has a citywide. And some cities like Dallas have actually had an area like Singleton to do a sort of citywide MSD at Fort Worth as well. And some cities will consider. So even though they don't, you can get them to consider. Dry cleaning remediation program, which is a state program for dry cleaners and people and owners with dry cleaners. So it could be a strip center. It doesn't have to be a dry cleaner per se. The strip center owner could get into the dry cleaning remediation program. Corrective action, which can be used for residential, commercial properties, but also it's primarily industrial properties, like say Exide Battery, General Cable, guys like that. They're going to be typically in the corrective action. You have TCQ or EPA brownfields programs. I think we have some of the listeners today that have done lots of brownfields. Depends on the city. I know Denton has a brownfields program. Dallas had one for many years, but they don't have, I don't think, any money at this current time. Closure, here's a good key issue. Closure through any of these programs may not address all potential environmental concerns. Asbestos, vapor, construction. One of the things we run into is people think, I've got a VCP closure, I'm all good to go. Well, what if you're putting a below ground garage and you're digging out thousands of cubic yards of soil? We had a site in Dallas where right on 75, it was contaminated with perchloroethylene and its degradation products along with some gasoline. It got a VCP, but he was taking out 55,000 cubic yards of contaminated soil. Now, contaminated soil could easily be 30 to 40 bucks a yard, excavated and hauled to a landfill if it's contaminated as Class 2 non-hazardous waste. Wow, you're talking about some big money. You're talking about a deal killer. So this guy had to say, wow, are there any options? What can we do to get this deal done? So we had to come up with some options, and one of the options was, and they don't do this anymore, this was a couple of years ago, we were able to negotiate with one of the landfills to take it as cover material. So in that situation, it worked really good, and he avoided a huge cost that he was not really willing to take on. In fact, like I said, it would have been a deal killer. So going forward to now, we've had a couple of sites where, yes, it was going to get a closure, but there were some metals in the soil that we would have to haul off to a landfill, and so we had to include those costs to the buyer. Now, it depends on where you're working for. If you're working for the seller, it's one view. If you're working for the buyer, it's another view, and even if you're working for the lender, it may be a third view. But in this case, like in most of our cases, I'd say we're probably working for the buyer more often than the seller. In this case, the buyer wanted to know all his costs, not just the VCP, but what about construction? He had lead and arsenic, and the lead and arsenic was above the level for, well, it was below the cleanup level because it had a Class 3, but the problem, Class 3 groundwater, and I'll explain that a little later, but the problem was it was too high to call clean fill. And by the way, that's a tricky one. What's clean fill, what's not, what's the background, and we'll talk a little bit about background later, but keep these in mind. Like phase 1 and all that never includes asbestos. And we get the call at the last minute, hey, I got this old building, we're getting ready to demo it. Well, you may have asbestos and that may change your cost. So what are my options? Always remember these other items may change the cost of you doing the deal or your total value. So keep that in mind. Moving on. Talk about this one because I really think it's a great option. We see a lot of reports from other consultants that say, oh, you're highly contaminated. It's got lead. It's got arsenic. You are contaminated. You need to get into VCP. Well, I love that. Lee Corso, the guy that does the football stuff, he goes, not so fast. And one of the not so fast is, I've even had some of my own guys say high, and I keep saying not high. It's elevated above the background or the TCQ's default level. Okay, if you go to the fourth bullet down, for example, the TCQ's action level or protective concentration level or background for lead is only 15 parts per million. Well, I can go anywhere in Dallas right now or Houston and find, or San Antonio, name the city, and have more than 15 parts per million. I mean, I would make almost every property contaminated. Same thing with arsenic. Arsenic level is 5.9. I mean, virtually every soil we look at when we sample that is out in the country is going to exceed this level. My house in Plano, Texas, now you know where I live, is over 15 parts per million lead. And sometimes it's like old lead-based paint from old houses. In fact, years ago I did the West Dallas Lead Project, and we were doing all that from the smelter and everything else. We were finding that a lot of the high leads were caused from the old paint that had abraded and was still in the soil that was causing those higher levels, not the smelter itself. So, well, does that mean all these properties are contaminated and need to get into a program like VCP, and you're going to spend X $1,000s and X months to get done, 10, 12 months at best? Sometimes in a Class 3 groundwater you get out in 5 to 6 months. No, and the screen out of turp is this. What if I do a site-specific background, 8 to 10 samples, they do a calculation, upper protection limit, and they come up with 50 or 60. So it helps that level come up from an unrealistic 15 parts per million to maybe 50, 60, even 100, 200 sometimes in some cases. That's a more realistic level to deal with than 15 parts per million for lead or 5.9 for arsenic. In those cases, if you can prove that the real background, the urban background, so to speak, is say 50, and my sample, highest sample is 45, then I can screen out of the program, screen out of turp, and not have to go into the program itself and spend X dollars in X months while I'm waiting to do a deal. So this has worked very good. And the last bullet is, you can send it to TCQ or not. You have an option. I mean, it's nice to have the TCQ's concurrence. And I would prefer that personally if it was my property. But it takes time, and sometimes they'll do it in 30, 45 days, but you can expect 45 to 60. And we've worked with a couple of coordinators lately. They're doing a good job and taking a look at our screen out of turp letter and issue a no further action letter, which you can have for the file for the lender, the buyer, seller, everybody to say, hey, TCQ looked at this. They do not want to put it in a program. They're saying it's not an affected property and there's no further action. It's been very useful to us. Now, obviously, if you have 500 parts per million of lead, this is not going to happen. It's going to be in a program. But for those that are on the low side, there really wasn't a true source on the site, it was more urban background, it's a great option. We don't see it a lot, but we do believe you should consider. VCP. Next one. One of my favorite programs is the voluntary cleanup program. I know Chuck was listed and Jay Karsten as possible listeners today. I'm going to tell you right now, it's a great program. It was a great program. It is a great program for real estate deals. And, when we deal with other states, wow, no VCP for them. Let me tell you, it's a big difference. I've worked in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Oklahoma. And Oklahoma has a VCP program, but the Texas VCP program is really good. It issues a certificate of completion for all contaminants, all media, and current and future landowners. Couldn't get any better than that. I don't know of any reopened other than the change from use commercial to residential. As a note, we got a site right now that was closed commercial because at the time that's what they wanted. Now a new buyer wants to put apartments on it. We had to go back into the program. And I thought it would be a little easier, but you have to resubmit the reports and everything. It takes a little more time. In retrospect, if I had to do it again, I'd have said, well, let's get it to residential on the first case, just in case you have a change in use and it gives you options in selling the property. In this case, I'm working for a seller. So my recommendation is consider carefully, because when you go submit to your application to VCP, you have a choice, commercial or residential. Now, if it's a big industrial facility, it's commercial. And a lot of industrial properties have an option of VCP or corrective action, and typically they're going to go corrective action for the other reasons. One of the big advantages of VCP, there is a time limit for review, 60 days. Now, they don't always meet that, but I would say most of the time they're pretty good about that, and they know they have the clock running. It's a pay for play, so to speak, program where you have to pay into the program. It's only $1,000, but they will usually exceed that number, and your client will get ongoing bills. and the industrial people listening will get ongoing bills. It's not bad, but it will add up a little bit. And it's a key thing to know. One of the things in the TERP program that's really good, I'll just mention here, is a Class 3 groundwater. A lot of places in Dallas, Fort Worth, and that's where I am, and that's where I work mostly, have an option of a groundwater Class 3 groundwater, which means a low yield. If it meets the low yield criteria of 150 gallons per day or less, I mean, if you're in Richardson, Plano, unless you're in South Dallas, close to the Trinity, you're usually going to pass, and then some of the cities in the mid-cities will fail as well because they've got sandier formations. But if you got that nice clay, chalk, Austin chalk, Eagle Ford shale, and some of your limestones in Fort Worth, you've got a great chance of having a groundwater Class 3, and you can get a 100 times multiplier on your cleanup level. So if you're dealing with, it's a PERC. So the cleanup for PERC and groundwater is 5 parts per billion. Well, with a groundwater Class 3, I can go to 500 parts per billion. 5 parts per million cleanup for PERC is very difficult. There are a lot of remediation strategies out there. Cleaning sites to 5 parts per million and keeping it there. See, a lot of times the guys can get it to there. There are a lot of treatment technologies that work really good, but they rebound. And that's the problem why a lot of these sites stay in the program for 10, 15, 25 years. It's hard to keep it down because the water keeps moving through the formation, and there are hot spots missed by the treatment. And the option of having a groundwater Class 3 to move that level up makes treatment a lot easier. Or in many cases, like in Dallas, we've dealt with a lot of cases that just getting a groundwater Class 3 classification meant we could close it. We closed a couple of properties down on 75 right off the highway near North Haven Nurseries for a hospital that we got a groundwater Class 3. All the contaminants were below that. It got a closure in about 5 months. Now, it's not always that fast. Depends on the coordinator. Depends on the caseload. These days, they're pretty booked up, but it's a lot quicker than a standard closure down to 5 ppb. In fact, that site was in between the 5 ppb and the 500, so it would have required treatment, long-term monitoring. Who knows? It might have still been there without going to groundwater Class 3. There are other reports you may need, but off the top, most VCP cases in our experience have been low-end Class 3. 4 to 6 months, 10 months to 2 years, unless it's got a lot of complications like free product, DNAPL, LNAPL, that require a lot of work to get out. And those kind of industrial type sites are obviously going to take more time and more money than 2 years. So, but on commercial real estate properties that we deal with, we've closed over 125 sites. And a lot of those were 2 years or less, or pretty close to 2 years, all right? Moving on. I'm going to have to pick it up. IOP is a great program. If you did not cause or contribute, key things that the TCQ looks at is no shallow soil impacts. If you've got PERC at 3 feet and you've got groundwater at 15, it's probably not going to happen. They look for a high concentration at the boundary and a low as you move across the property. No on-site sources identified in the phase 1, although they may give you a little ground there. But those are the big things they look for. And if it doesn't meet that criteria, you may not get an IOP. And I think the TCQ has been a little harder and looked at the IOPs a little tougher as time has gone on. At the end of the process, they will issue an IOP certificate. Big key is it does not run with the property as does the voluntary cleanup program. So you have to resubmit when you have a new property owner. And we've had some sites that had a VCP and an IOP. The VCP was for the off-site dry cleaner next door that the PERC came onto the property, but we had a underground storage tank on our property, so we got an IOP for the PERC, and we had to put the, I think it was, actually it was benzene and metals. That's why it had to go into the VCP instead of just the leaking petroleum storage tank. So we had a combo on the property, so it worked out just fine. But some of those sites will be that. IOP, next one. The leaking petroleum storage tank is a program for the tanks upper underground or above ground. Some people still ask us, can I get reimbursement money? Nope. If your case is not already in the program, it's not going to happen. It's pretty much they're sunsetting a lot of that. They use the action levels versus the TERP, protective concentration levels, and they issue a no further action letter versus the certificate of completion. I think the key thing here is for leaking tank sites, when we redo phase 1s, phase 2s for people, and it had a leaking tank site, we're looking at the phase 2 data. The question is this a new release or is it just the residual of the historical release? And we get the data, we're going to shop at the TCQ to determine, do you want to keep the site closed or you want to reopen it? And I would say this, TCQ is not always consistent. We've had some cases where I thought they would close it, keep it closed, and they said no. And you can do a little argument, but you're not going to probably win that argument or not win it very often or consistently. So unfortunately, we had to reopen one site that we personally thought would stay closed, and then there's a couple of them that were closed, and TCQ decided to keep them closed, which we thought was a fair assessment. So it is a case by case with the coordinators at TCQ whether they would look at the data and keep it closed or reopen it. But it's critical that TCQ, I think, has that sort of agreement with you so they can say no further action again, so that when you're you as a buyer or a lender are looking at it can say, yep, TCQ concurs that we're not going to reopen this site. Because again, not all the consultants are going to agree. It's just the way it is. I mean, I always tease people if, hey, my wife and I don't always agree. Well, guess what? Neither are consultants or anybody else. So I may say I think it's going to stay closed. Another consultant, if he's working for the buyer, may say, no, I think they're going to reopen it. Well, if TCQ says we're going to keep it closed and here's your no further action letter, it's resolved. All right, moving on. One of my favorites, VCP, MSD. Remember I joked about the MSG? You'll remember that. MSD. The city, it basically restricts the use of groundwater, and most cleanups at most sites is driven by the groundwater and is not the soil. So MSD is going to take that cleanup level, say for PERC of 5 ppb, which is a really low number, and take it all the way to 500 parts per million. That's a big change, big difference. Now, a lot of sites, if you get an MSD, and it's got to go through the city first, so if it's in Dallas, the city of Dallas with Lori Trolson has done a lot of MSDs, a couple hundred. It's been a very successful program for them, but it has to be certified by the TCQ. If you go to TCQ and you haven't got a pre-approval from the city, not going to happen. I listed a few cities here, but this list is not even close to complete. And we've had good luck with talking to a few cities that weren't on this list or weren't on. You can go to TCQ website and look at the MSD, and it's got a list of all the cases, and you can look at all the cities. But a lot of cities that are on the list, they're open to a case-by-case or at least discussing it. We've actually worked with 3 different cities. Harlingen being an example with Cindy Bishop. We worked with the city of Wiley recently. We worked with the city of Wichita Falls to discuss this whole MSD, and they were amenable to it, and they ended up getting an ordinance. And again, more and more cities are coming into it. I think San Antonio's approved an MSD, or they've approved an ordinance to do so and move forward. And some cities will never do it. I don't know that Austin will ever have an MSD, but who knows. But it's a great program, and it gives you a big option to close sites that in the past weren't closed. And a lot of times it's driven by the economic development guys because they want to see development. They want to see revenue coming to the city. So it's a use restriction on groundwater, changes the cleanup levels, and makes the property available to get a closure when it couldn't get a closure in the past. By the way, it's not a standalone program. You can't just say, oh, I got an MSD, that's it. It's going to be combined with corrective action, VCP, I think you can even have LPST, but you can't do it in the next program, which is the DCRP. The Dry Cleaner Remediation Program does not use the MSD as a risk-based remediation strategy. The DCRP is a state fund program. W&M is actually teaming with Terracon as one of the DCRP contractors. So we work on DCRP sites, but I'm not personally a big fan for, it's a commercial real estate. It has its place, but DCRP sites, you're going to have to pay some back fees, $1,500 per year plus I think a $1,200 additional fee. So it's $2,700 per year. I think you use it from 07. I think that's 9 years. You're paying back fees for, and you're going to pay basically $1,500 per year going forward. I like the joke. My internal joke is it's like the Hotel California. You're going to get in there, but you're never going to leave. You want to leave, but you can't leave. And one, they can't use the MSD. I mean, a lot of our sites we've closed. I mean, you might use remediation strategies, but you may have to use an MSD, which is a risk-based strategy. Sometimes PERC is very difficult to treat. So DCRP, and the other thing, they've got limited money and they've got a lot of sites. So you may get ranked pretty low, or you may be ranked pretty high, and all of a sudden you go, hey, you changed the ranking. They shuffle it around on a regular basis. So it's good for long-term holding, and it may be the best thing for you in a deal to get the deal now, and you don't want to get into the voluntary cleanup program. And there's other issues. If you try to switch out of the DCRP and go to VCP, you're going to have to pay, if I'm correct, for how much money they put into it for remediation. So keep that in mind. But it has its place. But I think if you're looking at shorter-term deals, you might want to reconsider. Corrective action. Corrective action is going to use the Texas risk reduction rules. Key difference with the corrective action compared to VCP, no timeline for reviews. It's the same group that's doing the TCQ that's doing the VCP and remediation, but they don't have a requirement of 60 days. They're going to issue a no further action letter versus a certificate. And the no further action is good, but it just seems a little vague. It says no further action. Versus the certificate of completion, all media, all contaminants. The other advantage is corrective action, I could focus on soil metals. I don't have to do all source areas maybe. I don't have to do soil and groundwater. I can pick and choose a little more, and I think it's good for industrial facilities that don't want to do the whole facility. They just want to look at a release they had at one part. But doing a VCP would be so complicated on their entire property because they have maybe 30 source areas, and that the cost of the investigation closure would be just excessive. Now, VCP, you can focus on little areas if you want to, but my experience is with working with a number of industrial facilities, they prefer the corrective action over the VCP. Brownfields, I won't mention that much, but there hasn't been as much money. I know we work for the city of Denton on their brownfields, and there's a couple other brownfields locally. It was more robust in the past, and maybe it'll get robust in the future, but it's been very effective in the past. The city of Dallas used it extensively for a couple of properties. Superfund, I loved Superfund. I worked at West Dallas for years when I worked at CDM, and it was a great program, or that was a great cleanup, so to speak, but we don't do a lot of Superfund site now, and I don't think there's sites, and there's not a lot of money. There's limited funding. And then there's Railroad Commission sites. They do have a VCP, voluntary cleanup program for oil and gas properties, which I know they've been trying to encourage facilities to get into. And then of course a Railroad Commission type site, if it's got groundwater contamination, I think it's going to move into TCQ. Okay, and I haven't hit all those. I mean, we don't have time to hit every program out there and with a lot of detail. Remediation strategies. W&M overall has preferred risk-based closure strategies for most real estate deals. In some cases, we obviously have to do some kind of remediation, whether free product abatement, floating or sinking product, or maybe we're close enough to, say, you got a groundwater class 3 that we think we could do a little bit of treatment and knock it out. But invariably what happens with treatment is you get great results early. You get it's hard to get, so you get an exponential curve where you can never get to the bottom. It just goes on and on. It gets really difficult to get that final step to meet your closure requirements. For example, if you have to be 5 ppb for 4 quarters, a whole year, usually the first 2 come up good, the second 2 bad, so we prefer the risk-based. Can we get a groundwater class 3? Is it a low yield formation? We see a lot of consultants work from other guys that come in that they didn't consider whether it was a class 3 or not. And they're sitting in Dallas, like near Richardson or North Dallas. Unless you got data you already know it's going to fail, it's sitting right next to the Trinity River, or it's in the mid-cities where you got that sand, lots of sand, you know you're going to fail. It's worth at least looking at. Can we do an MSD? Every time somebody calls me in a city outside of the Metroplex or big cities like Houston, I'm going to think, hey, do they have an MSD? So I'm going to look at the list of MSDs, you know, to see if the city has an MSD ordinance already passed, or I'll go look at their website and check. You know, and sometimes we go to some cities, say MSD, and they're totally bewildered. What are you talking about? But more and more people are understanding what an MSD is. Site-specific background. This has worked at a lot of sites for us to close without a lot of expenses, either through a screen out of turp or to get a modified cleanup level that's more amenable and more cost efficient. And it's been very helpful. But in some cases, you're going to have to remediate. It could be digging up the soil, it could be treating the groundwater, which I mentioned a few of them here, excavation, biotreatment, and soil gas. A lot of sites are not going to fix the soil gas, they're just going to put a vapor barrier. That's pretty common these days. And that's usually just a part of the cost of doing business, is we'll put in a vapor barrier. Obviously with a small footprint, it's going to be a lower cost. A huge facility, it's going to be a big cost. So it's usually a price per square foot. I think we usually see anywhere from $3.50, $3.25 to maybe $5 a square foot for a vapor barrier. But it's a part of the cost of doing business, and it goes back to that question, how much is this going to cost? Can I still do the deal? Or is this not what I'm looking for? All right. Closure strategies. To me, it always comes down to, did the property get properly assessed? Looking at the data, does it all fit together? Does it make sense? Or we got data gaps? What is the data saying? What's the big picture? A lot of times we have other people we're talking to, and they don't see the big picture. Is this a perk release? Is this a dry? I saw a consultant's report. There's perk everywhere. It's the leading compound. There's some trichloroethylene, dichloroethylene, and vinyl. Common signature dry cleaning, and the consultants go in all different directions of what the cause is and whatever. The site never had a dry cleaner, but there was a dry cleaner next door. They never brought in the term dry cleaner in their reports. They never mentioned it was probably an off-site source. So they had spent $250,000 with soil gas assessments, plume evaluations, $250,000. They were still in the assessment phase. This is out in northwest Texas. They never thought, well, maybe this was a dry cleaner. Perk, tri, di, vinyl. Common signature for dry cleaner. What's the big picture? Proper assessment, cost estimating. How much should this really cost? Well, we got an MSD VCP on that site, and it was not $250,000. It was right at $100,000 at a city that did not have an MSD. Scheduling, how long did it take? How long is it going to take? That case was, I think, almost a year and a half to 2 years because the city did not have an MSD, and it was a process to get an MSD. So the big closure strategy for the buyer is, hey, I'm not going to wait 2 years. The seller's not going to wait that long, so this isn't going to work. Or, hey, maybe we can still do it, and we'll talk a little bit of that as we go forward here. Can buyer get a right price reduction? If I'm the seller, I'm thinking, how little can my price reduction be? If I'm the buyer, I'm thinking, how big a price reduction I could be. So they're going to have to meet in the middle, or the deal probably won't get done. So that's part of the negotiation. What's a fair deduct? Or does the seller going to say, hey, now I'll just take over the deal and I'll fix it myself, and then I can try to resell it later at full price? And that's just a decision they have to make, because obviously the less you know about your contamination and how much it's really going to cost, and you don't know all, none of us know, none of us consultants have the magic wand to figure out exactly how much it's going to cost, but we can get an idea or a close approximation. So the question is, the seller is, how much speculative costs are there going to be involved in this that may raise the price? How good a investigation? Comprehensive, again, limited. Can I screen out the program and get this thing done quickly and make the deal happen because it's just some soil lead? What's my best TCQ program? Or in the case of oil and gas, Railroad Commission? Does the city have an MSD that I can incorporate to basically do a nice risk-based closure without any treatment? And by the way, some MSD sites have such a high level of PERC or trichloroethylene that you still have to do some treatment or soil excavation. Can we make a deal prior to regulatory closure? And this is an important question because sometimes the bank and the buyer-seller can agree that we'll put some money in escrow. You know, let's say it's a 50,000. You know, most of our VCP MSD combos are going to get anywhere from 65 to 100, 125 grand. Just most, not all. Some are going to go higher than that. Can I put that money in escrow maybe with a multiplier of 1.25, 1.5, whatever the bank feels comfortable with, to go ahead and do the deal now, and if we meet benchmark, get the money back. So can we do a deal? Let's put it in escrow and make it happen. We've worked with guys that have done that. Obviously, the better their financials with the bank, the more likely that's going to happen. Or of course, guys that have cash up can do whatever they want. Now, the issue with that is if a guy cash up wants to buy a property, he's going to want a big discount. So for the seller, if he's dealing with a cash guy, that guy's going to want more discount because he knows that guy's got limited buyers because he's got environmental problems. A key issue, work with the TCQ. If you're confrontational with the TCQ case coordinator and staff, you're not going to get a lot in my experience. I think a key issue of how to shorten this whole time frame is what can we do to work with the TCQ case coordinator in an effective manner and their managers to get a closure. First of all, I hear it all the time. Consultants, or even sometimes I remind myself, when's the last time you talked to the case coordinator? And sometimes stuff gets lost at the agency. We had a situation one time where we sent a report in and it got lost in the mailroom or wherever it was, but the coordinator never got it. We assumed they got it, so there was some lost time with time it was submitted to the time that they started the process. It wasn't our fault, but again, be proactive, just communicate without being a pestering influence or a pestering person, but being involved. And it's not just like a mystery black box, but working with the coordinator to, hey, where's my APAR, the Affected Property Assessment Report? How's it going? Is there any questions you might have? As a quick note, if TCQ has 60 days to review the report, the APAR, and at the end of that they send out a notice of deficiency letter, well then you have time to review it and fix it, but then you send it back, they have another 60 days by, I think, their requirements to review it again. So that's another 2-month delay. So the key is make sure your APAR is complete so you don't have another 2-month delay. And the other things you can do is sometimes you can talk to the coordinator and say, is there anything I'm missing that I need to plug in so that I don't have a 2-month delay because I have to resubmit it, even with some simple stuff. So we like to try to avoid that and keep it moving as fast as possible. The last question I always ask people, do you have a good team? Do you have a good team that has successfully closed sites? And we hear people say, well, this is my first site. Or you can go to the TCQ's VCP list. If you don't see their name, they haven't done VCP sites. So it's critical, I think, that you get somebody that's done VCP, LPST, IOP. Have they successfully completed those kind of sites? We're running out of time on the not so fast, but you can see my sort of horror stories, so to speak. And one quick one is, if I go out and sample groundwater from a temporary well for lead, I'm going to have lead 99% of the time because there's sediments in the water. And temporary wells are not real good at getting the turbidity or the sediment out of the water. So I go take a quick sample of the site because I'm not trying to keep my prices low. I've got turbidity. I'm going to have lead and arsenic or whatever other metal, and I'm going to fail, and I'm going to end up in a program. So be careful that you're not just looking at the turbidity and sediment, but you're actually seeing the metals in the groundwater. Summary. Accurate assessment and cost estimating helps you make the right deal. Find somebody that knows what they're doing, can do that accurately. Can I screen out a turf? That's my first question when I look at data. Now, obviously, if I got perk everywhere, I'm not screening out a turf. It's a more, in my experience, a low end, it's more metals and maybe some TPH or something like that, but it's typically, in our experience, metals. What's the best program for me? Ask some questions. If you've got a consultant you're working with, ask, tell them what you want to do, what you're trying to accomplish with the property. I want to redevelop it. I'm going to put a Walmart on it. I'm going to put this on it. I'm going to put a restaurant. Talk, communicate. I want to do the deal and sell it in 3 years. Those are key things that the consultant needs to know so that you make the right deal. Is there a risk-based option, or do I have to do long-term monitoring and treatment? I always tell people the longer it's in the program, the more you're going to pay your consultant and your attorney. The quickest way to get us, the best way to keep our bills low is get us off the deal. And I say that in truthfulness is I would love to be on sites forever in a way, but it's not best for the client. It's not best for you guys doing deals. You got to get us off the deal and complete the process. Closed sites may still have environmental problems. Remember we talked about that? Vapor intrusion, added construction costs. Don't forget those items. And don't think that just because I got a closure, that's my only cost. And I don't want a client calling me and say, hey, I just found out that I got to haul all this soil off as contaminated soil to a landfill at 35 to 50 bucks a cubic yard. That's an extra cost that they weren't anticipating, and that's not a good cost. And I always tell people, you get business by repeat business and referrals, and that's not going to get either of those. Whose side are you on? Am I on the buyer side? I'm on the seller side, or I'm the lender side? Obviously I got to tell, figure out who's trying to accomplish what and get to the bottom of it. But I'm trying to minimize delays, because the other question I like to know, when's your closing date? When are you trying to do this deal? 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? What can we accomplish in that time frame to get you there? So that's all I have in an action-packed 1 hour.
Well, you did a great job. That was almost right at an hour, Mike. Appreciate all your hard work.
Well, let me interrupt real quick. Yeah. Let me interrupt. We have turkey downstairs that Roddy, one of the drillers, brought by, and we've been smelling it for 1 hour.
It's been rough, but thanks, Mike, for great information. I want to let everybody know that I will be getting out these slides on the website this afternoon, and I will send you out the link so you can rewatch this video or pass it on to somebody who might be interested in it, and it should be on, I would say, by 3 o'clock this afternoon. Thanks, Mike, again. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys, for listening.
Right, you bet. Bye-bye.